All right, so picture this. It's around 2575 BCE, and Pharaoh Khufu has just taken the throne. His very first order of business? Building his tomb. But not just any tomb. He wanted the biggest, most incredible monument the world had ever seen. And his architect, a guy named Himyunu, told him, I can do it in 20 years. So let's get into how they actually pulled off what is still one of the greatest engineering puzzles in all of history.
What Hemiyuno couldn't have possibly known is that his creation, the Great Pyramid, would stay the tallest man-made thing on the entire planet for almost 4,000 years. Just let that sink in for a second. For nearly 4 millennia, nobody built anything taller. That right there tells you just how insane the scale of this challenge really was.
And the pace they had to keep? It's just mind-boggling. To hit that 20-year deadline, the workers had to quarry, haul, and perfectly set one gigantic stone block every 3 minutes. And that's not just during work hours. That's 24/7, 365 days a year for 2 decades straight. No breaks.
Which brings us to the million-dollar question, right? How on earth did they do this? I mean, we're talking about a time with no modern machinery, no iron tools. They didn't even use the wheel for transport. So how did they build a literal mountain of stone with such mind-blowing precision?
Well, like any massive project, you have to start with the basics. For Hemyumenu, this meant solving 2 huge problems right off the bat: finding the absolute perfect spot, and then getting a team together that could actually build this thing. Hemiyunu's first move was just genius. He picked a spot on the west bank of the Nile, symbolically the land of the dead where the sun sets. But more practically, it was a solid bedrock plateau. This was key. It meant the foundation was solid rock, not shifting sand that would collapse under millions of tons of weight. And in an incredible time-saving hack, they actually carved down into that bedrock to form the pyramid's bottom layers.
Okay, so who built it? Let's just bust the biggest myth right now. It was not built by enslaved people. The reality, which we know from archaeological evidence, is that a skilled workforce of about 25,000 Egyptian citizens built the pyramid. These weren't just laborers. They were housed in a dedicated town, they were fed well, we're talking meat and beer, and they saw this work as a great civic honor, their duty to their king.
So you've got your location, you've got your crew, now comes the real headache, the logistical nightmare of quarrying, shaping, and then moving a literal mountain of stone across the desert.
And when I say a mountain, I'm not really exaggerating. We're talking about an almost unbelievable number of stones. The final pyramid was made of more than 2 million individual blocks.
And these weren't just little bricks. Some of the granite beams used deep inside the pyramid weighed up to 80 tons. That is the weight of a modern locomotive engine. And they had to move it without cranes, without trucks, without even wheels.
So they had to be incredibly clever, right? They used the stone's own natural properties. The limestone was actually soft when they first cut it from the quarry, which made it way easier to split into blocks. Then, huge teams of workers would haul it on these massive 30-foot-long cedar sleds. Once the stone was out in the open air, it hardened up, and only then would they do the fine shaping with pretty basic tools like copper chisels and wooden mallets.
Okay, so moving stones on flat ground is one thing, but this brings us to the single biggest puzzle of the Great Pyramid, the question that historians and engineers still argue about today. How in the world did they lift those stones higher and higher?
And the totally honest answer is, we don't know for sure. It's kind of amazing to think about, but with all our modern technology, the exact method they used is still one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. They didn't leave behind a blueprint.
Now, the leading theory, the one most experts agree on, is that they used a system of ramps to drag the stones up. But that's where the agreement ends. Was it one massive, straight ramp that got longer and longer? Was it a ramp that spiraled around the outside like a corkscrew? Or maybe even a ramp built inside the pyramid itself? We just don't know, which honestly makes what they did even more impressive. Let's shift gears and go inside the pyramid, because the exterior is really only half the story. Hemiyunu was under this constant, unique pressure. The pharaoh could die at any time, and his tomb had to be ready to go at a moment's notice.
His solution to this was absolutely brilliant. He planned for 3 different burial chambers built in stages. As soon as they started, they dug a chamber deep underground. That was the first backup plan. Then, as the pyramid got taller, they built a second chamber higher up, which we call the Queen's Chamber today. And finally, the true resting place, the Grand King's Chamber, was built right in the heart of the pyramid.
And this final chamber was an absolute masterpiece of engineering. To hold up the crushing weight of all the stone above it, it wasn't built from limestone. It was constructed from massive blocks of super strong granite, basically creating a fortress of stone to protect the pharaoh forever.
This timeline just shows the unbelievable level of foresight they had. See, granite is way harder to work with than limestone. They had to quarry it by just pounding it for hours with heavy dolerite rocks. Hemityr knew this would take forever, so in the very first year of the project, he sent 500 workers way down south to the granite quarry. For 12 straight years, they just worked on those massive beams so they would be ready at the exact moment they were needed high up in the pyramid. That's planning.
So the main structure is complete. The pharaoh's chamber is secure. Now it was time for the grand finale. It was time to turn this incredible engineering project into a breathtaking work of art.
The rough, stepped pyramid we see today is really just the inner core. Originally, that whole thing was covered in a casing of brilliant white limestone, and then they polished those casing stones until the pyramid had perfectly smooth, gleaming sides that shone in the desert sun.
And the final touch, the cherry on top, was the capstone, called a pyramidion, right at the very peak. And this was covered in electrum, which is a natural mix of gold and silver.
You have to imagine what that looked like. These gleaming white sides and a golden peak catching the sunlight, it must have been just breathtaking. It was said that the Great Pyramid shined like a second sun over all of Egypt, a true symbol of power, ingenuity, and a civilization's belief in eternity. And it really makes you wonder, what other secrets are still locked away inside?